Thank you for the introduction, Michael. And let me share my screen, on my slides. Then, let me collapse your all so that it doesn't block anything. Okay, cool. I'll just do a final touch to move this little bar over here. Okay, cool. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Emma. I'm currently a postdoc at University of Chicago. The talk I'm giving today is actually one of my PhD projects that got dragged into my postdoc. My postdoc project is about building a probabilistic machine learning framework that can infer rheology that I hope I can share with you all at some point. But today I will talk about anisotropic ice development near the eastern shear margin of Thwaites Glacier. And this project is in collaboration with TJ Yan. I used his airborne radargrams results, and with Euler and Eliza, where I used their APRES results. Together, I will show combining these radar observations with my modeling, we can infer ice fabrics developments near the eastern shear margin of Thwaites Glacier. So the shear margins are the lateral boundaries between fast-flowing ice and slower surrounding ice. It is essential to understand where the shear margins are and what controls their locations. And of course, the shear margin locations are influenced by numerous factors, such as basal topography, hydrology, thermal state, etc. And one of the most direct control is probably basal topography. In many places, such as the one over here, shear margins align with bedrock heights or valley walls that laterally confines the fast ice flow. However, there are also many other examples where the shear margin do not really line up with those features. And the eastern shear margin of Thwaites Glacier, which is shown on the bottom right here, is one of those cases. So this is Thwaites Glacier, and this black line over here is the eastern shear margin. So some of the previous study look at the bed across this margin and found there's no major change in bed topography or roughness between the inside and the outside of this shear margin. And this suggests that the current day location of the shear margin is not strongly controlled by local bed topography. And that raises an important implication, which is this margin may be susceptible to migration. So the next question is then, will this shear margin migrate, or has this shear margin migrated in the past, and how do we know about it? And this is where radioglaciology become really useful. Now, radar techniques can allow us to infer ice fabrics inside the glacier, and ice fabrics can preserve information about past deformation and flow history. So to explain that, I want to briefly step back a little bit and talk about what we mean by ice fabrics. So ice, as we all know, is an anisotropic material, and that anisotropy comes from its crystal structure. At the smallest scale, ice crystals are made of these hexagonal rings of water molecules. And when that structure repeats in space, we define what is called a basal plane, which is this blue plane here. And the direction perpendicular to it is called the z-axis. So ice tend to deform much easily along basal plane than in other directions. And under stress, individual ice crystals tend to rotate their z-axis towards orientation that makes this deformation easier. So if all of those z-axes are randomly orientated, then ice behaves more isotropically, and we often call this case a weak fabric. But on the other hand, if the z-axes are more aligned in some preferred orientation, then ice becomes more anisotropic, and we often call this case a stronger fabric. So using radar polarization and phase information combined with this anisotropic property of ice, we can now estimate the relative strength of fabric using radar data. And here is one example of using radar data to infer the fabric strengths. These figures are from a paper by TJ published in 2021. So the left three panels here are the surface speed map of the eastern shear margin of Thwaites. And these black and white lines over here are the flight paths. On the top right, the background is a radarogram across along this yellow transects across the shear margin over here. And the colors on top of the radarogram is the inferred fabric strength. So the pinker color indicating stronger inferred fabric. So one thing that really stands out of this data is how heterogeneous the fabric is. In particular, we see this region of relatively strong fabrics about 15 to 20-ish kilometers inside the ice stream, which is away from the current day shear margin, which is the vertical dash line over here. And what is interesting is that this location doesn't really correspond to a very high shear strain rates. So generally speaking, higher strain rates tend to promote stronger fabrics. Well, of course, this is not a very strict rule, but still this mismatch suggests something else might be going on. So what could have caused this localized fabric maximum inside the ice stream? One clue of what might be going on comes from an earlier modeling work by Paul Summers, who was a former PhD student in Jenny's group, and I think he's now a postdoc at Rutgers and Georgia Tech. So his model showed that the shear margins of Thwaites are able to migrate, and their migrational speeds depends very strongly on the basal conditions. And his model showed that the shear margin migrated around 6 kilometers between the year of 1996 and 2014. So this leads to the hypothesis that we want to test here. Could this localized fabric maximum be the remnant of some past shear margin? In other words, this part of ice may have experienced strong shear in the past, developed a strong fabric, and then being left behind as the shear margin moved somewhere else. So to test whether this idea is plausible or not, we need a model that can simulate both shear margin scale ice flow dynamics and the evolution of ice fabrics. And to do that, I used a multi-scale model that I developed earlier. It couples a glacier scale model with ice crystal physics at every grid point of the glacier model mesh. So at every grid point, we assign a representative microstructure, and then we take the local flow field, things like temperature, pressure, and strain rate, and we pass all of that into a pre-trained neural operator. This neural operator emulates microstructural simulation L, which is a microstructure model, and then it predicts how the microstructure evolves under those local flow conditions. And then we translate the updated microstructure into ice viscosity through rheology and pass that back into the same grid point in the glacier model, therefore completing the two-way coupling. So we apply this model to the eastern shear margin of Thwaites. This is again our study area. Our model setup is 2D, so the model domain is oriented across the shear margin and along the depths. So the ice is flowing out of our model domain. And we compare the model results to two types of observations, AP-res measurements and fabric estimates that's derived from traditional ice penetrating radar. So here is the first comparison of the with the AP-res data. The black dots on the surface speed map are the locations of the AP-res, and the top left is the measured observed fabric strength, and the bottom panel is the modeled results. So overall, like generally speaking, the model captured the main patterns, which is strongest fabric at the center of the shear margin, and then decreasing both towards the ridge and further into the ice stream. And next, we want to apply this model to a nearby transect, which is the transect that we see local fabric maximum inside the ice stream. And here we want to know whether the model can more or less reproduce the interior fabric anomaly that we see. But because we don't really know what happened in the past, we're gonna test out several scenarios. So in the first scenario, we assume the shear margin has always been at its current day location, which is x equals 0 here. And this transect C is here, as you can see on the surface speed map. So this transect still sits in the accelerating part of the ice stream. So in addition to the lateral shear, this part of ice also experiences longitudinal stretching. But since our model is 2D and can't really resolve the long flow velocity gradients, so we prescribe a longitudinal stream rate based on surface velocity data. And in this case, the model, which is on the bottom here, does predict slightly stronger fabrics inside the ice stream, which is encouraging, but it can't really reproduce the non-monotonic pattern that we see in the data, which is strong, weak. Well, we don't really have data at the center, but we know the fabrics should be pretty strong at the center. So in the second scenario, we assume the shear margin migrates gradually from about 15 kilometers inside the ice stream, which is roughly speaking where the anomaly is, to its current day location. So the left animation shows the changes in fabric strength and the shear strain rates. And in this case, we define gradual as the center of the shear margin moves from x equals 15 and stops at every 1 kilometer point until it reaches x equals 0, which is the current day shear margin. And the bottom right is the final fabric distribution. So in this case, the model predicts strong fabrics pretty much everywhere the margin passed through, which makes sense from a numerical perspective. But again, it doesn't really match the observed non-monotonic pattern. So in the, apologize for that. So in the third scenario, we assume the shear margin was at its former location and then just jumped abruptly to the current one. And we define abrupt as the center of the shear margin moves from x equals 16 at every 0.1 kilometer point until it reaches x equals 15, and then just jumped directly to x equals 0. So in this case produced two fabric peaks, as you can see, one at the older shear margin and one at the current day shear margin, which roughly match the observations that we see in the data. So in the fourth scenario, we assume the shear margin was at its former location, but in this case, we're assuming that it's moving at a mixed speed, which means it's slowly moving and then fast moving at every 2 kilometer point and then finally stop at its current day location, which is x equals 0. So this case also produces two fabric peaks, but the fabrics in between the peaks is also stronger, which also makes sense. So far, so here are all the 6 transects, AA prime at the top, all the way to FF prime at the bottom. And the radar observation are showing on the side over here. So we want to see that the, roughly speaking, where the fabric anomalies are spatially. And here we have a very, very simple definition of anomaly as the difference between the largest and the smallest eigenvalues of the orientation tensor to be larger than some threshold. And in this case, we define the threshold to be 0.2. So it is essentially just a simple filter. So here's the filtered results of all the 6 transects. I highlighted all the anomalies in gray boxes over here. So here are the 3 gray boxes. And I also marked their spatial locations as the black little segments on the transects in the middle on the surface speed map here. And the location of the basal trough, by the way, is these little black dots down here. So finally, I would like to show a very first attempt of a comparison between the modeled transects and the observed fabric anomaly along CC prime, DD prime, and EE prime. So the anomaly again are shown in are highlighted in the gray boxes and also in between the vertical lines on the right in the model results. So this is not a very thorough test. As you can see, the spatial locations of the anomalies only match quantitatively, and they do not really match qualitatively, only match qualitatively and does not match quantitatively at all. So we need to continue fine-tuning the model and make this comparison more rigorous. So to summarize, we observed some heterogeneous fabric pattern across the eastern shear margin of Thwaites, including some strong fabric signal inside the ice stream. And then we hypothesized that this fabric anomaly could be due to a past shear margin. We tested 4 scenarios and we find a static shear margin at its current day location plus some longitudinal stretching is unlikely to explain the fabric anomaly that we saw. And gradual migration is also unlikely given the data that we have right now, which is really not a lot. So we cannot completely rule it out, which is why I put a little question mark here. Abrupt and mixed speed migration are more likely, but again, tests are not exhaustive. Our results can only roughly match the pattern, but not the values. So to do more quantitative analysis, we need additional tests, and it will be also great if we have more additional data. But these results so far suggest that ice fabric could act as a valuable record of the past shear margin dynamics. So I would like to stop here. Here's my email and a recent preprint of the multiscale model that I mentioned briefly in the talk. Please feel free to ask me any questions during the discussion or send me an email. And I think that's all I have to share.
Awesome, super cool work, Emma, as always. And next we will have Natasha presenting her work. So Natasha, please take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you for that introduction. So, hi everyone. Thank you to the conveners for organizing this and having us. So today I'll be going through some experimental studies we did looking at how subglacial water and especially sediment mechanics impact glacial slip during transient effective pressure loading. So before we get into the experiments, I want to talk a little bit about the environment we're trying to simulate. So for these studies, we modeled the conditions generally off of Antarctic grounding zone environments. So the grounding zone is marked in red in this figure to the left. Where marine terminating glaciers go from grounded to free floating. When they're free floating, they're subject to tidal oscillations. The impact from these tidal fluctuations can be seen in the moment diagram to the right. Ice here in this system mechanically acts like a beam. So where the tide goes up, the grounded ice upland presses down into the till. And when the tide goes down, that pressure is released. So it creates these subglacial pressure oscillations that alter the mechanics at the grounding zone. So how do we actually simulate these conditions? We use a device called a cryogenic ring shear device that's located here at UW-Madison. This device can simulate the same pressure, temperature, velocity conditions as in natural settings. So this is done by spinning a cylinder of ice, you can kind of see in this diagram to the right, over a rock or till bed. Surrounding the chamber is a glycol bath that controls the temperature, you can see it marked over here, to about 1/10 of a degree to 1/100 of a degree. Pressure is applied in the bottom through a hydraulic press. So with this experiment, we programmed this hydraulic press to oscillate in a sinusoidal function, the pressure under various amplitudes and periods. So this is what it actually looks like in real life to the left. Another cool feature is that the walls are clear acrylic, so we can actually track the ice till or ice sediment interface throughout the experiment. So on the right, we have a little video of what that looks like. So in terms of the data, what are we looking at for like my purposes? This is an example of kind of a general 24-hour cycle series that we ran with varying amplitudes of pressure. So on the y-axis, we have effective pressure, and the x-axis, we have just time series. On this plot to the right, the y-axis, we have tau, which is shear stress or drag. And on the x-axis, we have the effective pressure. So what we find is that there's something called hysteresis present within the system. So hysteresis just means that there's different values of one variable depending on the direction or change of another variable. So this is easier to explain if we just pick one particular effective pressure. So here I picked 40 kilopascals. On the upwards trending portion with this red arrow, you can see on the right and also the left, that's where the pressure is increasing. You see in general, there's less shear stress than on the downwards trending portion. We see this happens kind of repeatedly over different cycles. So what is actually causing this? So is the main question. Generally on the loading portion of the oscillation, which you can see on the left, you have an increase in pressure from this hydraulic press from our applied settings that's increasing the pore water pressure. So it's squeezing all this pore water, and that pore water is trying to drain or escape from the system. If the pressure increase occurs faster than the pore pressure can respond, the pore water pressure increases. And so, which in turn decreases the shear stress, so the drag within the system. On the other end, when it's unloading, which you can see to the right, all that water is trying to get back into the system, which decreases the pore water pressure, which increases the shear stress. And so you can see that within the hysteresis. So that kind of takes us to the overall objective of this whole study, which is to determine how the hydraulic conductivity coupled with the sediment mechanics with effective stress, amplitude, and period alters the hysteresis in a variety of different conditions. So we did this by comparing three main studies, two of which I'll focus on in this talk. So the synthetic beads and the braithomurkiokel or Iceland till. We'll start with the lowest conductivity sediment. So highest conductivity sediment, which is the glass beads up here. So that's pretty similar to kind of coarse gravel. We'll go to the lowest conductivity, so it's hardest for the water to actually get through, which is this Iceland till you can see at the bottom. We also, for a different study, tested 11 Antarctic till samples. And so this Iceland till is in the same range of hydraulic conductivity as you'd find in Antarctica. So it's a good analog, at least. We are focusing most on the synthetic sediment and the Iceland till because that's where we varied the amplitude and the period. With the Horicon till, we just varied the amplitude. So how are we going to quantify hysteresis extent? So we'll do that by running the experiment, isolating each sinusoid, plotting the shear stress versus effective pressure diagram, and then just calculating the area. So I'll start off with some glass beads. So this is the really high conductivity sediment that I talked about. So it's pictured here to the left in the ring shear. With this till, we had to use very low periods, so like short timescales to capture the hysteresis, just because it was so conductive, the pore water equilibrated very fast. So more natural timescales would be about a day for a cycle, diurnal timescales. Here we have a max of 20-something minutes. So we're starting with the highest amplitude tested, which is about 34.5 kilopascals. Here we see that there's this kind of non-monotonic trend present throughout it in the hysteresis area. So hysteresis area is on the y-axis, period on the x-axis. So what you can see is that initially at the lowest period tested, there's less hysteresis area, so a smaller extent of hysteresis. And then it steadily increases until it gets to this peak, and then it decreases over time after that. So as we get to slightly lower amplitude oscillations, this one's about 28 kilopascals, you can see that there's still this non-monotonic trend, but it's less prominent than the higher amplitude oscillations. And this peak hysteresis here is found at a shorter period than the higher amplitude oscillations. So we can go even lower to about 20 kilopascal amplitude. This initial non-monotonic decrease and then trending upwards isn't as visible. We can kind of see a peak there. As we get to even lowest amplitude, we can kind of just the end of that non-monotonic trend, but we can't really see the peak. So it gets a little bit more complicated when you get to the Iceland till. So because it is so much less conductive, we had to run this at longer time scales. So this is ranging from 5 minutes at the very start of this x-axis to 24 hours at the very end of the x-axis. And again, the y-axis is this hysteresis area. I should say to the left, this is the pit in Iceland that we dug it out of. And this is this sieved Iceland till inside the ring shear after. So all together, you can see how the trends change with varying amplitudes of oscillation. At this lowest one, which is about 16 kilopascals, we can see there's a general non-monotonic trend, just not quite as prominent as we saw with the glass beads. So there's a peak here at around the 1 hour mark. So yeah, the x-axis is in log minutes, just to have it all fit. So goes from 5 minutes, an hour, 6 hours, 24 hours. We can see this peak is closer to around an hour, but it's a little bit muffled. As we get to a slightly higher amplitude oscillation, the 28 kilopascals, we can see this peak kind of is present further along at a longer time scale. And we only tested a few different periods with this just because it takes a lot longer. So the peak was probably around 6 hours, but could be, plus or minus a few hours. And then as we get to the higher and the highest amplitude oscillation, this 34.5 kilopascal oscillation, we see that it's trending upwards, similar to the same non-monotonic trend we saw below and also with the glass beads. We just ran out of ice in the experiment, so we weren't able to get to the 24-hour period oscillations to see where it peaks and where it dips. But in general, we can see there's a similar trend that we saw in the glass beads. So we can plot this general non-monotonic trend, kind of this initial decrease, upwards trend towards peak hysteresis. And then as it steadily decreases, we think that's when it's approaching the pore water equilibrium and the mechanical equilibrium. So with the glass beads, it's kind of gray black box, we think we're capturing a significant portion of this kind of general trend, where with the Iceland till, just because it's so much less conductive, we're capturing maybe just the peak of this hysteresis area trend. So now if we go back to the sediment cartoon, the heterogeneous sediment above is less conductive. It's more similar to the horecon of the Iceland till, where the one at the bottom, this is the glass beads, is the significantly more conductive till for the glass beads. With the homogeneous sediment, there's no smaller grains to fill the pore spaces that we see above, and that limits the conductivity. There's also just mechanical changes with how the sediment reacts with an actual natural till type with varying sediment sizes versus a glass beads where they're all very small, very symmetrical, and very, very hard. So now we've seen these trends in the experimental conditions. We wanted to see if we could actually find an analytical solution and model this. And so what we did, so we took a representative time series, which you can see up here. And we modeled it using Terzaki's 1D consolidation equations. This is one of the kind of fundamental equations in soil mechanics. We took an example of our experimental data. So this is just showing with 24-hour periods how the hysteresis changes with increasing amplitude. And so we modeled the exact same conditions through this 1D Terzaki's consolidation equation. So what we can see with this general model is that the shapes kind of match. This sort of this 10 kilopascal amplitude, the smallest amplitude. It's also very small with the model, and it gets steadily larger and larger as we increase amplitude. But what we didn't know here is how would that change with different sediment types? How would that change with different periods, different amplitudes? So what we did is that we calculated the area of our model and compared it to the area of our actual experimental results and created this. So this, we found an analytical solution to solve the area of the modeled hysteresis loops. and compared it to our experimental hysteresis loops. We solved over a variety of conditions. The C value here is just the coefficient of consolidation. So the coefficient of consolidation is just a parameter that explains the rate at which soils compress under loads. That's directly linked to hydraulic conductivity. So on this kind of right-hand axis, we go from more diffusive, so more conductive, to less diffusive, which is essentially less conductive. The coefficient of consolidation just has some more information about the actual sediment type in that variable. On the x-axis, we have the period in days. So we're going from very, very short kind of milliseconds to long hundreds of days time scale. And on this left-hand axis, we have the hysteresis area again, ranging from no area at all to about 1,200. And so what we can see is if we look at the back of the glass beads data to this top right, we can see this general trend exists, again, with kind of all conditions that we find in our analytical model. So another way to look at this is just take certain conditions out of this model. So not giving you all the different coefficients of consolidation, selecting one that's a good estimate for the glass beads, and then seeing how it varies under different conditions. So this is just an example of the 34.5 kilopascal amplitude model result. And so we see the same general non-monotonic trend with a peak right here. The peak in our model, the peak is around 12 to 14 minutes, where slightly shorter in our experimental results, but it's about the same scale. We see this exact same shape that's captured in that time scale. And so we can also look at the natural till. So this is an example of the Iceland, the Braithamerkjökull till. So what we can see is that we're, for this 38 kilopascal amplitude, so slightly higher, we're capturing just this kind of upwards trending portion of the non-monotonic trend, which is also what we see in the experimental data. So you see that up to the right. So general conclusions. The extent of the hysteresis is non-monotonic at relatively short periods. Those short periods are relative to the hydraulic conductivity, so it changes depending on if it's glass beads or a natural till. The extent of hysteresis or hysteresis area increases with increasing amplitude. And also the extent of the hysteresis increases with decreasing hydraulic conductivity or changing of the coefficient of consolidation. So the more conductive the sediment is, the less hysteresis that'll be present. Thank you.
Awesome, amazing job, Natasha. And for the last talk, we have Jeremy Brooks, who is right next door to Natasha. So take it away, Jeremy.
All right, can you see that screen?
Yes.
Great, I'll get started. So thanks for having me. So I'm Jeremy Brooks. I'm a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin. This project is trying to derive a slip law that incorporates the effect of debris bed friction. So trying to capture some more physical heterogeneity at the ice bed interface than is typically included in slip laws. And this work was done in combination with authors here at the University of Wisconsin, as well as at Los Alamos and Sandia National Lab. So fast glacier flow primarily occurs through basal slip. So in these grounded regions of Antarctica, or also for Greenland, most of that ice velocity occurs through basal slip. So understanding the mechanics of that process is quite important. Typically, in an ice sheet model, we describe that physics of basal slip using a slip law. So some relationship that relates the basal shear stress to different glaciological variables, mostly the slip velocity and the effective pressure. So as written here, it's really a friction law. And typically we assume that that basal shear stress is due to ice having to flow around obstacles at the bed in the case of a rigid hard bed. But there's a lot of disagreement about what the form of that slip law for hard beds should look like. So all of these different sort of curves here, these slip laws, have some sort of have been proposed in the literature and have some sort of theoretical or occasionally empirical support. Now, most ice sheet models tend to use slip laws that are somewhere in this region, but there's still quite a large debate about the form of that slip law. So another complication with slip laws is that there's the assumption that basal ice is clean, which means the only source of basal drag for ice sliding over a hard bed is ice squeezing up and around these bed obstacles. So in particular, it's assumed that there is a thin frictionless water film that separates the ice from the underlying bed. And what that means is that there's no local tangential shear stress right directly on that ice bed interface. But in nature, we typically find that basal ice is quite dirty, so it contains rock debris or sediment that slides over the underlying bed. So you can imagine that that rock debris would poke through that frictionless water layer and actually provide a local tangential source of shear stress. So we typically think about just clean ice or dirty ice, but in reality, the ice bed interface is this sort of combination of conditions at the glacier bed and in basal ice. So this is shown here sort of discrete combinations of these two, the glacier bed and the basal ice. But really, they're more continuums here. And the slip laws that we use in ice sheet models and base our theories on usually only assume clean ice conditions for ice sliding over a hard bed or deformable sediment. So these theories of basal slip don't span this whole range of ice bed physical conditions. So what I want to do in this study is focus on one of these physical conditions, which is debris-laden ice sliding over bedrock, and try to understand its slip law. Now, this particular condition is probably really common in nature. That's because in deglaciated regions where we have bedrock, we often see abrasion. So this is a mark of debris-laden ice sliding over the bed. So therefore, we think that this is quite a common ice bed condition. So just a brief review of existing work on this to think about how debris bed friction might change the form of the slip law. There are two main variables that would affect debris bed friction, which affect the contact forces between debris being pushed against the underlying bed. So if we assume that the clean ice slip law would look something like this, then if we have effective pressure that controls debris bed contact forces, the slip law would look something like that, where you're increasing the magnitude of basal drag, but you're actually not changing the functional form of the slip law in terms of plotting slip velocity versus basal shear stress. An alternative theory is that it's velocity-dependent drag, so this bed normal component of ice velocity that flows around the debris and causes an amount of rate strengthening. So in this case, it means that as you increase the rate of basal slip, you increase the basal shear stress. So the form of the slip law actually would change in that scenario. Or you could have a combination of both, in which you have both effective pressure and velocity affecting debris bed contact forces, leading to a slip law that looks something like that. So those are the sort of three possibilities for how debris bed friction changes the slip law. And I just want to note here that empirical evidence of this effect is pretty rare, but one study published by Neil Iverson and others in 2003 installed this tablet underneath a glacier called Ingebrigtsen in Norway, and actually found that the local shear traction due to debris sliding over that tablet was very high, on the order of 100 to 160 kilopascals. Now, this is the local tangential shear stress, but it implies that over the entire glacier bed, this could provide a really strong resistance to ice flow. So the goal of this work is to derive a slip law that incorporates that debris bed friction. So we're going to measure debris bed friction directly using laboratory experiments, and then use ice flow model results from Elmer ice to generalize those results to a wider parameter space and more realistic bed geometries. And then a third part of the study, which I actually won't talk about today, is exploring the large-scale dynamics of the slip law using ice sheet model simulations. So we'll start with our laboratory experiments. So here I used a custom-built cryogenic ring shear device at the University of Wisconsin. So this is the same device that Natasha was just talking about in that last talk. And the idea is that we can simulate what it's like in a subglacial environment using this apparatus. So in particular, we can control and monitor the most important glaciological variables, which are the effective pressure, the flow velocity, and the ice temperature. So we set these to be realistic glacial conditions, and we both prescribe and measure our ice temperature to be at temperate conditions. And then through a torque sensor installed at the base of our sample chamber, we measure the basal shear stress. So using this device, we conduct two sets of experiments where we derive the slip law. In both of them, we use a hard, rigid bed composed of these marble pieces shown here, where we have two inclined steps separated by flat pieces. These inclined steps are meant to give us sort of roughness elements that are realistic underneath glaciers. We conduct one set of experiments where we build a layer of clean ice on top of this marble bed and then slide it at different velocities. And here's an example of what that ring of ice looks like after we've built it on top of this bed. So those are our clean ice experiments, which are essentially our control experiments. And then we add this layer, this band of debris that was sourced from a glacial till here in Wisconsin, and use that as a debris-laden ice that we slide over this bed underneath the same experimental conditions as the clean ice and see how it affects the slip law. So those are our two sets of experiments. We do this for a range of slip velocities. We measure basal shear stress to directly derive the slip law in these experiments. So here are the results. So here's slip velocity versus basal shear stress, and these black points are the clean ice slip laws, experimental data for clean ice conditions. What we find is if we fit functions through these data, is that this tends to validate a regularized Coulomb-like slip law, where we approach an asymptotic upper bound. However, a highly nonlinear power law with an exponent of about 1/5 also fits our data quite well. So for clean ice conditions, this gives us some empirical validation for a Coulomb-like slip law. Now, what happens if we add in debris bed friction? So if we just add in that layer of debris-laden ice, here's what our data looks like. Our basal shear stress increases by about a factor of 2, and we appear to have a different functional form of the slip law. So in this case, the slope through this data is greater than through the clean ice data. Now, if we interpret these results, that increase in basal shear stress is probably mostly due to pressure-dependent source of debris bed friction. But that additional rate strengthening, so that change in slope, tells us that there's probably also a velocity-dependent source of debris bed friction. So if we combine that together and assume that these terms are independent, we have a debris bed friction slip law that is that clean ice term, so Coulomb-like, and then a pressure-dependent and a velocity-dependent term. And these coefficients have a lot of physics that are kind of hidden into them that I'm not showing for the purposes of this talk, but especially this gamma coefficient here, which describes the velocity-dependent component of debris bed drag, fits pretty well with the previous theory published by Anna Thompson and others in 2020. So we've used this experiment to directly derive a debris bed friction slip law and seen that it's quite different from clean ice conditions. Now, the next thing we want to do is think about evolving water-filled cavities. Because in our experiment, we had a particular ice bed contact region with debris that was in contact, with the same amount of debris in contact with the bed for all these different slip velocities. But in nature, as you increase that slip velocity, you are increasing the size of these water-filled cavities and decreasing the ice bed contact areas. So that effect might actually counteract the rate strengthening we observed in our experiments. So we want to test that using numerical ice flow models. And in particular, we want to use the most realistic numerical ice flow models that we have. So in this case, we use 3D simulations that were previously published by Christian Helenow. And what he did is he used 3D bed topography derived from drone-based mapping of alpine glacial forefields. So in particular, these 4 glaciers shown here, to get these bed domains shown here on the right, which captured the 3D roughness of these actual deglaciated glacier beds. So we used his simulations where he used Elmer ice to derive the slip law. And he found in clean ice conditions that the slip law looks like this for these 4 different glacier beds, basically regularized Coulomb-like. What we do is we take his outputs where he has ice bed contact area, he has effective pressure, he has the velocity field, and everything that we need to calculate debris bed friction using those simulations. And for a range of different parameter combinations, which are shown here in these pink lines, we look at what debris bed friction is, what the slip law is, for these different bed geometries. What we find is 3 different things. First, we see that debris bed drag increases with slip velocity. So even if we have evolving cavities we still see the same effect where we have rate strengthening for these different parameter combinations of debris bed friction. The reason that that occurs physically is because above a certain slip velocity of around 10 to 20 meters per year, there's not much change in the ice bed contact area, which is plotted here in black. But there's still an increase in the bed normal component of ice velocity, which increases that velocity dependent component of debris bed drag. So evolving cavities doesn't really counteract this increase in debris bed friction at greater slip velocities. So that was our first finding. Our results are pretty similar to the experiment. Number two, we also see that these debris bed friction parameters span a pretty wide range of behaviors. So you get very different slip behavior depending on these parameters. And in particular, that amount of rate strengthening is mostly dependent on the debris concentration in basal ice. So here we just are showing differences between clean ice conditions up to about a 40% debris concentration. And finally, we see that there's a difference in the slip behavior across these different glacier bed domains. And it has something to do with the morphology and the roughness of the beds, where Castlegar Glacier is generally rougher than the other beds tested here, but Rhone Glacier is smoother, which tends to have less rate strengthening compared to the others. So the bed morphology also matters for debris bed friction. So putting that together, our experiments and the numerical ice flow model results, we see that the debris bed friction slip law has a functional form that is distinct from clean ice conditions. And one way to describe it is having a clean ice term, a pressure-dependent debris bed friction term, and then a velocity-dependent debris bed friction term. So that's our debris bed friction slip law that we've derived and then further tested using these numerical ice flow model results. So a couple or a few main takeaways from this work is that we've empirically validated slip laws for clean ice conditions and debris-laden ice conditions for ice flowing over bedrock. And in comparison with other laboratory experiments that have derived slip laws, we see that the one with debris-laden ice sliding over hard bed is the only of these slip laws that actually has that enhanced rate strengthening. And that could be quite important because it tells us that if we continue to, say, increase slip velocity due to environmental perturbations, then that having debris-laden ice pushing back on the bed is one way to help resist and arrest ice flow, compared to these other slip laws in which basal shear stress is rather rate independent. So the physics of debris-laden ice sliding over the bed could be really important for regulating overall glacier dynamics. So debris bed friction is a really important way to resist glacier flow. Our second takeaway is that this debris bed friction slip law, which is quite a bit more complicated, includes a variety of different parameters, can be reasonably well approximated as a nonlinear power law, with quite a bit of range in that power law exponent, depending on details of these parameter values. But this helps because it can provide some physical validation for using power law slip laws and ice flow models, rather than trying to use a whole different other slip law. Finally, some cases where it could be useful to use the slip law directly would be in landscape evolution and erosion modeling, in which the physics of debris bed friction are relevant directly here, and then also thinking about spatially heterogeneous bed conditions. The reason being that places like Thwaites Glacier, in which ice flows along a range of bed conditions from soft to hard beds, using a slip law that can capture that with different terms for each component could be particularly useful. So with that, thanks for listening, and I think we're at the point of the seminar where it's time for questions.
Lots of Zoom applause for our three speakers. And again, amazing job, Jeremy. And yeah, let's open the floor for questions for any of the speakers. If I can go first to break the ice, say, Emma, I have a question for you. Well, kind of two questions. Um, so for your neural operator that you for your model that you developed, how do you choose what grain size and what like phi to put into the model to begin with? And then two, like how long, like what time scales do the shear margins actually migrate? I might have missed that in your talk, and how far do they go back? And you're also muted, Emma. Oh, Emma, you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. So for your first question, the initial state of the microstructure is synthetic. Well, it's a 2D model, so it's basically a synthetic square of some polygons in it. And that grain size is evolving as you're simulating. So I cannot tell you exactly what is the grain size at any point, but I can tell you, roughly speaking, the starting grain size is on the order of 5-ish millimeters in sorry yeah, around 5, I think, in general, on average. And that will change as your simulation goes on. And generally speaking, it will become larger. And for your second question, about, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about what is the time needed for the shear margin to migrate? Is that your time? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So that is something that we really don't know anything about. So it will be really hard to constrain our model. And also because our current model is 2D. So the way that the shear margin is moving is because I tell it to move. So it's basically forced to move from this location to the next location and then to the next location. And at each of these intermediate steps of moving, it's solving for a steady state at that location. And then after it reached the steady state at that, for example, x equals 1, and then it moves to x equals 2, and then solve to the new balance steady state location at x equals 2. So how I currently define the different type of movement, like gradual, abrupt, or whatever, is by whether it stopped at this location at all. For example, abrupt is like it jumps from x equals 0 directly to x equals 10 instead of stopping at x equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's like a very simple way of how I define it. That is because of the limitation of the 2D model. If you want to actually simulate the migration like really thoroughly, comprehensively, you may need a 3D model for it. And also because it's just really hard for us to constrain it from the data, how it might be migrating.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions in the audience? And you could use the raise the chat feature in Zoom or just unmute yourself. That's completely fine. If not, I have another question for Natasha. So Natasha, can you explain a bit more how the your Icelandic till experiment work? Because that's one really cool too. Like I was just kind of I was thinking like if you just like scoop up a bunch of till in Iceland and then put it on the ice, like do you have to compact it again to kind of keep that similar-ish porosity or like the natural state as it was in?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the first thing we do is once we ship it all back from Iceland is we sieve it so it's a appropriate grain size for the ring shear, just so it scales correctly. Then outside of that, before we even start oscillating, we run the experiment to a kind of quasi steady state, and so that itself will compact the sediment. And so we compact it when we're installing it and then putting the ice on top, but then we have to run the actual ring shear experiment non-oscillating for 3 to 4 days for it to actually compact it enough to reach a steady state. And then we can start the experiments.
Yeah, that's super cool. And any other questions in the Zoom room? Yeah. I might have a hat trick here with questions. Jeremy, for you, one the ring. I mean, like the same with Natasha. The ring shears are just super cool. I could probably watch videos of the sediment deforming and thinking about it for a while. But I guess how does like how can you, I mean, this might be more of a, might be more of a rhetorical question, but like, how does like it scale? You know what I mean? Because like the ring shear is relatively, smallish, like I'm assuming like a few meters. But can you interpret the, let's say the really cool sliding law, the friction law you'd propose at the end? Like, is that like on a similar scale of like a few meters, or is like, a glacier wide thing?
Yeah, good question. So I guess there are two scales we could refer to. One is the scale of like the roughness on the bed itself, and then one is on the
Mm,
scale of the debris in the ice. So I'll answer that debris in the ice first. So that scale that is relevant and most relevant for debris bed friction actually does fit within our ring shear. The reason being the kind of maximum amount of debris bed friction you can get from that debris in the basal ice depends on both the radius of those particles as well as how many you can fit as a function of like area over the bed, basically. And it turns out that sort of gravel sized particles, which is what we put in the ring shear, is the size distribution that maximizes that amount of drag. If you had like big boulders spread around, each individual boulder, for instance, would have a greater source of contact force, but you wouldn't be able to fit them as efficiently in there. And then for the scale of bed roughness, that's where it gets a little bit hazier because it depends on, sort of imagine like roughness elements of a variety of different amplitudes and wavelengths. How does that affect this debris bed friction and the evolving cavities? Hard to say. So we tried to extend this to like the tens of meter scales using those Elmer ice flow simulations. But then trying to think about even larger scales, which can be a bit harder to capture even in ice sheet models, would be quite interesting too.